So would you trust your kid to spend time alone with a hard-out punk rock frontman covered in tattoos all the way down to the wrist, a man that when he wasn't on stage himself was a part of a heaving throng of beer and fury at early shows from the birthday party, relishing at being sweated on by the great Nick Cave? Well, if your kids have ever read The Day That My Bum Went Psycho or any of the Treehouse books, your kids absolutely have spent time with that man. Andy Griffiths, thanks for coming around, man.
Pleasure.
Some kids' books do try to tackle topics of social import. When a kid's story is right, it's so right. And sometimes they can just be a bit on the nose.
Yeah, and I think it's great that we have books for a very wide cross-section of the audience now, books that were never around.
Yeah.
And they definitely have their purpose. But the books that I loved appear to have no purpose whatsoever other than the pure roller coaster thrill of a story well told. It's often hard to define a message in a book like that, but it doesn't mean it's without purpose or without great value. And so that was always the sort of book I was attracted to as a kid.
Yeah.
And it's the only sort of book I'm capable of writing as an adult. If I try to write a book that demonstrates the importance of climate to us, it comes, I could do it, but it would be more one or two dimensional because it's enslaved. It's trying to get a point across. Whereas a good story, you have to be open to it going in multiple directions and unexpected directions that can surprise you as well as the reader.
As someone who does this for a job, when did you realize it could be a job? I'm guessing you played in bands early on. Like being an author probably was it part of the plan?
It wasn't really even a thing you could conceive of doing at that point. But yeah, I was in bands. I loved writing the lyrics, and I ended up as the front man because I was the one who wrote the lyrics. So
it was punk, wasn't it?
Yeah, sort of punk, grunge, experimental, anything goes in early 80s Melbourne.
All right. So in venues that I'm guessing are now pokey rooms.
Seaview Ballroom was the mecca of Melbourne, and Prince of Wales just down the road.
Wow.
So that was just any person making any sort of noise whatsoever could have an appreciative audience.
See, now I'm like, and this is the part where you tell me the story how you ended up back at Nick Cave's house.
I did meet Nick Cave once. I slapped him on the back outside the Astor Theatre after a legendary 1983 birthday party concert. And I was happy to be able to do that. Look, I didn't know what I'd seen. It was a primal energy, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure.
Yeah.
And that set a kind of expectation.
It was your red right hand. That's what it was? No? I'll say it is.
Well, during that gig, he leaned across the audience and I had his hand and he screamed in my face. And I did think, as a emerging lead singer myself, this was, God passing the torch to me. And that's always been a very special moment until I realised that he's always leaning across the audience and always very much touching and connecting with the audience. So it wasn't special to me, but it was a very special moment.
But I've been to gigs where, I grew up in Brisbane, so no one ever toured, and we certainly didn't have the scene that you had in Melbourne. I mean, it's the scene that Tech Deadly and the Dum Dums were around, which then became the Cruel Sea, and the Saints and
Tex
stuff like
Perkins,
this. Pig City's a fantastic book. I thoroughly recommend it. Yeah. But I was a part of the band scene that came about 10, 15 years later when the government changed and, long hairs weren't getting beaten up in the street so much.
Right.
But I would camp out for tickets to go see a band that had come from overseas. Nothing shat me more when they didn't look at you or they didn't say anything between a gig, between a song.
Yeah.
It's like, I came here to connect with you, man.
Yeah. You don't want a recital.
No.
You want to see the real people in the moment, messing up if necessary.
Yeah.
That's what you want.
Those experiences of when you're then on stage and you're figuring out what connects with people, surely that informed the work later on when you're trying to connect with the reader.
Absolutely. Because I wasn't, a gifted singer in any sense.
That's the best part about punk music. You didn't have to be.
You didn't have to be.
You just had to mean it.
You had to mean it, and you had to do something. And so I had a histrionic stage act, and I was teetering on the top of speakers, making wonder whether I'd fall off or not, which apparently I did many times, but without injury because I was always drunk. But you need to connect with that audience and make them feel something has happened. And so when I, a few years later, became a high school English teacher and discovered all these kids completely disconnected from reading, I was like, it's not an either or choice. Yeah. You don't have a choice between reading and movies or computer games. You have both. Yeah. They all have something to offer. And I made it my personal mission to connect with just my class initially, to write something that made them go, oh, yeah, wow. And I think that might have been the day my bum went psycho, just a very short story about my butt jumping off my body, running away and causing chaos. Yeah. And they went, can you write about that? And I said, there is no limits to what you can write. There's no limits to what you can imagine. Yeah. Can we write something? And I was, as long as it's not another obvious part of your body that's any other part of your body apart from the one I know you want to write about. And off they went. And so we had this little creative writing thing going in the classroom, and I'd self-publish their work with a photocopier and staples, and then I started self-publishing my own work. And just like we did in the bands with cassette tapes into the record shops, I started putting my little books into bookshops and record shops because I just thought that's how you do it. It's punk rock. Yeah. You don't need a publisher to say this is great.
And I'm sure it was a time before that when you had a little swipey card on the photocopier at work, you just, there's a couple of reams of paper and a toner cartridge.
Yes. Yeah, the Victorian State Education Department was my...
Mate, B105 in Brisbane
my benefactor.
B105 in Brisbane have no idea how many posters they printed for my band on A3 paper, on hundreds plastered all over UQ and QUT. Thank you so much to those guys for subsidising my income.
Yeah, and it's a really, as a emerging artist, you've got to use whatever you can, whatever means possible.
You mentioned seeing teenagers disconnected from reading. What happens when our kids get disconnected from reading?
They're not experiencing the full range of their imagination or its capacity to, make an enormous difference in your life in every possible respect you can imagine, whether it's reading, at a very basic level, reading directions on a medicine bottle. If you can't read, your health is going to suffer as a result. I've worked a lot with the Indigenous Literacy Foundation, and it opens up possibilities for those tiny communities to interact and have a say with the wider Australian population and have a say in their own what happens to them and their own possibilities for acting in the world. So there's small and there's big, but there's also really importantly and really easy to underestimate the idea that you have a second life, that you're going as a school student, you're in an institution with rules and regulations and they want you to knuckle down and conform because that's easiest for them. But in the other sense, you've got a world of books in your head where chaos and danger and there are no rules. And I took sustenance from that as a kid because I was always into books. And I knew that school wasn't the whole world. Yeah. There was a big world out there.
The moment you recalled earlier, the anecdote about the kids going, oh, can we write about that? Just even opening the idea of, possibility and imagination, they can play a role in, how you get your car fixed or where you're going to go look for work or what person might be a good partner.
Yeah. I had one kid once tell me, I don't need to learn to read because I'm going to be a professional footballer. And I was like, well, good luck with that, and I hope you get there. But when you do, they're going to put a big contract in front of you. And if you can't read that contract, they're going to run rings around you, use you up, and you'll be spat out, So literacy is you're going to need that. Now, I never knew whether that kid grew up to be a professional footballer and took my advice, but But it seems to me reading is fundamental to whatever you're interested in, whether it's fixing your car, you can get a book or go onto the internet and find that information. I guess now you could watch a YouTube video, so you don't necessarily need to read. But everything I learned, even about writing, was given to me from books.
But it's important what you said earlier, like the idea that this current reality that I have now, there's possibility outside of that. And it might be you're watching a YouTube video, how to fix something's busted in your fibro, right? Yep. How do I fix that? Oh, there's a possibility that exists where it's fixed. From here to there, this isn't a permanent situation. I can change my outcomes here.
Exactly.
And expanding that in the kid's brain is really important.
It seems to me the most important thing, rather than teaching them a lesson about always being honest or, whatever. Those books that like to have messages.
There's a guy I used to work with at the radio station I mentioned earlier. He called it the poo bum wee theory. And that if you want to engage a kid under the age of 10, just mention any of those 3 words and they're on board.
Yeah. And that is what I discovered early on. Yeah. You got a big reaction when you went to those taboo areas. And the day my bum went psycho, eventually I wrote a novel because I thought, well, if they're so interested in this subject, why don't we harness that power to trick them into reading an entire 50,000-word book about runaway bums? And I took great pride in using that material. People thought, it's because you find bum humour really hilarious yourself, which is, I think there's higher forms of humour.
Fast, funny.
But they are, and if you're as wonderful an artiste as me, you can make them really funny by not even mentioning the word fart. And the word fart does not appear once in that book or the 2 books that followed, because I found that if I was reading a section of it, and I test everything I do in front of audiences just to see if it's as funny as I think it is. And whenever I would say the word fart, there'd be a mild titter. But if I implied the word fart, like I said, when a bum is talking to you, you've really got to block your nose because, it can get pretty unpleasant. And then you see them having to do 1 + 1.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, because it's farting as it's talking to you. And that creates a much bigger laugh. You're giving them some work to do.
Because they're using their own imagination to put it together.
Yeah.
And they're enrolling their own experience of those 2 variables.
Yeah.
Now it's a personal thing to them.
Yeah. And the surprise of that is a much better quality laugh. And so,
tell me about this. The idea of testing something is something that I've always loved to do. I'm working on, a new TV format. Like I will go into a theater and we'll get 80 people in the room and try it out. And I used to really not like feedback because I took it all very personally. And now I'm like, great, this is awesome. Now I know something's wrong. How do I make it better?
Give it to me now before I've gone to all the trouble of making the TV show. Then you tell me you don't like it. And the same with the book. Yeah. There's at least a year's work in a book. And so it was almost accidental. I started getting work as a visiting author in schools after leaving full-time teaching. I lived off savings for a couple of years and did the starving artist thing, and then was eventually offered work as a visiting writer. And so I was told I was put in schools 4 sessions a day, talk to them, do some writing with them, just turn them on to literacy. And I would talk to them and certain ideas would fire them up. I'd just notice it. So has anyone ever been in the shower and, you've put your foot on the plug hole and tried to fill it up with water? Yes. 100% of the audience go, yeah, I did that. Yeah, I flooded the bathroom. I did this. And I go, okay, this is a great subject.
Yeah.
So I'd do a little what if. What if you were serious and you sealed up the doors of the shower with silicone? Oh, that'd be dangerous. No, you shouldn't do that. And I was going, yeah, but let's think about it as a story where there are no There's no real danger in a story.
Yeah.
So we can explore this as a thought experiment. And I would get this whole sequence where the kid has sealed themselves in. They have to climb up into the roof because the tap broke. Worst case scenario all the time.
Yeah.
And then I would convert those, what are really stand-up comedy improvised performances, into fiction at the end of the year, which is a different beast because you haven't got the kids in front of you. But because you've been performing for them, you can imagine them. And that's much easier.
And so you have this extraordinary kind of test audience in front of you that have no problem with sharing feedback whatsoever.
Yeah.
And you can read the body language very quickly, whether it's working or
and
not working.
I'll still do it today. I'll bring a few paragraphs that I've written, and if I'm not sure about them, and I'll feel the sweat breaking out in front of my head as I read it in front of 1,000 kids, which I did with Adventures Unlimited. I just had a paragraph of this new idea that you were going to be the main character along with me. And I read it out to a group of 1,000 kids in the Australian school in Singapore. And they were just hanging off every single word. Yeah, one day you and me were walking through the forest and we came to a big hole. And you said, I wonder how deep that hole is. And I said, well, I'll use the method where I drop a rock and we'll count the seconds, and then through a complicated equation, we'll know how deep it is. But we couldn't hear it hit the bottom. And so you said, I've got a better idea. And I said, what's that? And you said, I'm going to jump. And I said, no, you idiot, don't jump. But you jumped. So I had to jump in after you. So that's all I had. And the audience were totally hooked. And then what?
Yeah.
And I go, well, there is no more. I haven't written any more. You tell me. You're the idiot who jumped. But yeah, so that told me that this could work.
Yeah. But again, it's the same thing of just getting enough of a hook in there to allow the listener to understand that they're in on the possibility of what happens here, and just not filling in the blanks too much. They do the rest of that work, so they get very, very enrolled, which is a very different kind of storytelling to what can be like. And we were walking in the forest, and there was undergrowth that smelled of nettles, and I could hear the twitter of the magpie. And so you're giving them all the intel rather than just the basic, and they have to fill it in.
Well, I know from being a kid, my imagination is alive. You tell me forest, I've already got a picture of a forest. I don't need you to describe it. That's just getting in my way now.
Yeah.
And words are hard. When you're learning to read, you've got to work for every word. You know, if you ever, I'm sure you have, heard a young child reading their first reader, the cat is on. Yes, very good. The mat. Yes.
To
so
he. Why is it to he? Oh, sorry, mate. Having to explain English words to a 5-year-old. Why is it like that? I don't know. We just don't say the K in the letter in no. Sorry, buddy. English is dumb.
Yeah, it is dumb and it's hard work. And so I sort of take that as my beginning point. And I think I'm not going to overload you with any words you don't need to read. And I've been lucky enough to work with Terry Denton for 25 years, and I worked out how to get him to illustrate that forest in a way the reader can just inhale it visually, and I can just get on with the story.
I would love to know how, like, you did that. Not only because, like, so very selfishly, I'm asking you this from my own behalf, but also whoever's listening who's ever read a picture book, unless it was written and illustrated by, there's a collaboration there. And at some point, as an author, you have to give a bit of that imagination over to another person. How do you offer ideas for what the page might be to your illustrator? Do you sketch it? Do you write it out?
Both. And in most cases, most picture book writers will never actually meet each other, the author and the illustrator. It's fairly rare. The publisher is the sort of go-between. And most illustrators go, stay away from me. I'll illustrate this the way I see fit. Don't want that meddling author wrecking my ideas. And if you're lucky, it's a nice fit. But I was lucky enough to meet Terry very early. And I'd also seen kids reading at free reading period in the library, and they'd pick a book out from the shelves and they'd flick through it suspiciously to see how small the print was and whether there's any pictures. So I said to Terry, just go up and down the margins and put flick pictures on the corners of the first Just books. And don't illustrate what I'm talking about because that's so boring. Everyone does that. Just go mad in the margins. And so he created a mad magazine basically in the margins. The kids are playing with the book before they've even committed to reading a sentence, which I work hard to make a compelling first sentence. But so he did that for 4 years, and occasionally I would go down to his studio down on a beachside suburb in Melbourne, and I would help him with ideas, and I'd just suggest random silly things like 3 blind mice, make them run up the clock. But they don't just run down again. They rip the hands off the clock and set fire to it. And he would draw this, and it was just hilarious, like we were in year 7 again. And I said, I want to do this like with you on a regular basis and create a work together where I'm just telling you things, you're giving me pictures, and those pictures are then firing us both up to see what else.
You have quite an output of work. What is it to have a cadence to it? What is it to know, like, do you plan, like, I'm going to do this many a year? How is it having that kind of regular deadline, I guess, in your life?
I love a regular deadline, and it's been 1 book a year for 25 years. Occasionally there's been 2 books. In really mad years there's been 3, but you're working non-stop because books suck a lot of time, and there's the writing, and then there's the considering what you've written, the testing of it, the rewriting, which is where you refine it all. So yeah, 1 book a year, and I love knowing that deadline is there. Yeah. And I know the kids are hanging out for it too. Yeah. And there's, some cases, saving up their pocket money. Wow. And that's pressure. I want to make sure they're getting the best possible book for that pocket money that I can make.
When it's delivered, and for people that have never been a part of the process, is that you don't just hand the book in. In my experience, I think I wrote my first book 4 times, because there's that many re-edits, and all you're doing with handing over the draft is like, that's just slapping the clay on the pottery wheel. And then from there, that's where the shaping comes in. And people that have your best interests at heart and want to sell as many books and be as successful, they tell you something like, oh, fuck, you've just made me a way better author, like with 1 sentence. I'm now far, and give me that feedback again. But then at the end of that, when it's all locked and loaded and you're off to print, what do you do in that time between there and launch to make sure that, because the tank's pretty empty by then, how do you fill that subconscious tank back up again so that you're ready to go?
There's always 1 or 2 ideas that emerge at the end of writing a book, not before you've finished, but you've finished it and you go, okay, have I said everything I need? Can I retire now? And you go, oh, no, there was just this little possibility in the book. Yeah. Suggest, wouldn't it be fun to go underground in the next book? Yeah. Damn, now I've got to write that book. And you only need 1 little possibility for ideas to start accumulating around it. And so in that period between finishing the book, I'm already on to the next one, because I know I need as much time as I can for all that pre-thinking, and just be open in the world to walk into a library or a bookshop or just, around the place, and you'll notice things. Yeah. If you're writing about underground, your brain will be trained to pick out that book on the underground, or it will pick something off the ground.
Well, it's like if when the baby's coming, you never saw strollers, and now all you do is go, oh, they've got the yo-yo, they've got the upper baby too. Like all you do is see strollers. Your subconscious goes, I know what we're attending to here. Yeah. But does it get practical? Like, did you go exploring tree houses?
No, I didn't. We were living in a second floor unit. It was a townhouse and it had 3 levels. And we would often work in the second floor, and it was up and you could see the beach and the walking tracks, and Terry would come over, and Jill, who was my first editor and my best editor, she would just slash 3 pages from any story I wrote and go, your story starts on page 4. You know, you're just clearing your throat.
Yeah, right.
But we would all be working together as if we were up in a treehouse. And I remembered being, 8 or 9 with my cousin David in his single platform treehouse. And we'd be up there away from the adults, lost in some, funny, weird game. And I just went, oh, my goodness, that's what I'm doing as an adult. I'm with my 2 friends and we're making up an imaginative game, only now we're writing it down and drawing it. So, yeah, that's where the idea of treehouse came from.
I've been in tree houses in the 80s that were built on, shall we say, like public land in between homes in Brisbane, probably without the parents' knowledge of the structural integrity of them. So high off the ground, I was terrified to be in them, and yet it was the greatest thing ever. Tree houses that people probably never let their kids do today. What in your, this is just my way to get towards it. There's reading, there's sitting, there's reading your stuff, and then there's taking that game that you were just describing in the treehouse outside and playing and experimenting with that imagination, writing through your actions through the game. Adventure-based play is something that's so important for us. Why do you think that's, it's something that we need to make sure that kids are getting enough of?
Well, I think there's a direct correlation between kids who play with their hands and take chances in real life and their ability to be engineers in later life, creative problem solvers. There's something about the tactile experience that's really important. And I grew up in the 70s where there wasn't so much parental supervision. We could just roam all day by the creeks and play in the drains and
get home by the time the streetlights are on. That was it. That was it.
The dark is the dangerous thing. But as Richard Glover...
Playing in drains is like, fuck me, I just remembered.
Yeah.
Playing in storm drains was like, well, it looks like there might be some rain, so maybe don't play in a storm drain today, kids. Like, that was it.
But, Richard Glover in his book, he says, look, don't get too attached to this idea that childhood was wonderful. He said this was not coming necessarily from enlightened parenting. It was perhaps coming from neglect, and not everyone made it through, So there is a happy medium of allowing your kids to be able to explore in a slightly dangerous fashion without catastrophizing that it's going to end in terrible tragedy. And I think we're way too far down that fear end of the scale at this point.
Both my folks were doctors. Mum used to always say that, like, kids have got to eat dirt. They've got to eat dirt when they're little. It's don't clean their hands too much. Like, she was always a bit worried about it. And this is a person who's dealt with infectious disease and things like this. She'd always talk about it's so important to get exposed to pathogens early on to just build resilience in you. But the same, I guess, could apply to, you kind of got to fall over a few times. You got to come off your BMX hard enough that there's a bit of gravel still stuck in your knee to know about being safe on a bike.
Yeah. There's only so much you can tell someone as a parent. There's nothing substitutes for real life experience.
And if you want to keep your kids safe, it's much like teaching them to, go to the toilet by themselves or something like this. If you want to keep your kids safe, ultimately at one point, they're going to be in a situation where they don't know they're about to take a risk that they don't realise how dangerous it is because they've never been exposed to risk and they've never been exposed to danger.
Yeah, well, I have 2 daughters, 23 and 30, and we noticed as our 30-year-old, when she was little, there was a drive towards the perfect childhood. Everything's got to be right, the right presents, the right birthday party every year, and it's not necessarily real life. Like, things do go wrong and the world doesn't conform to you. Yeah. And so it can be, I think, limiting and confusing as a 20-something when suddenly, Your parents aren't making sure everything is perfect. So a little bit of adversity, as you say, builds resilience. Yeah. And I think Jill and I we saw this program once that said good enough parenting is good enough. Try to get it right, but realize that you're not going to get it right all the time, and that's okay. Like, as long as, it wasn't quite as basic as food, shelter, love, but you're 80% of the way there.
If you get those three, you're doing okay.
You're doing okay, and all the rest that we're sweating about, the right bags for the lollies this year, is the 20%.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. When you mentioned earlier that when you're towards the end of a book, an idea may show up. Where do you keep those ideas? Do you have a note on your phone? Do you notice something and go, oh, look at that slippery slide is a different shape? Do you write it down somewhere? Where does it go?
These days I'll probably take a photo of the slippery slide and I might send it to a folder, ideas for next book. Mm-hmm. Certainly that's what happened. I was touring America and book touring across the world has been enormously helpful for when I'm lying fallow. And I was in Atlanta and it was raining for 3 days, and I took refuge in the CNN building, which is a vast cafeteria and amazing. You can see all the levels of the building from the inside. And I just was like, CNN, TNN, we need our own news, television news service in the treehouse. So that was an easy one.
Yeah, right.
It just happened to go. But I wouldn't have found it unless I was there.
Yeah.
So the next book had TNN, and on the bottom of every single page in the 65-story treehouse, there's a little, what's the word, encheiron?
Oh, the little crawler that goes across the bottom of the screen.
Crawler.
We call it in Australia, we call it the third line super. And Chiron is the name of the machine that makes it work.
Okay, so on every single page, there's a chiron that summarises the action on that page. And I don't know if anyone realises how much pain and sweat me and Jill went through to get 40 characters. There might be two idiots, get into a rubbish bin.
That's fantastic. The attention to detail, though, because when you're a kid and you read and reread and reread and reread and reread and you see stuff again and again and then you go, oh my gosh, like on the fifth reading.
Kids have got time.
Yeah.
Yeah. They've got a lot of time, and that's how I used to read over and over.
I love that. And this is the thing I think if there's one danger that people in the public eye, like myself, have had that get into, it's like as we start reading kids' books for our own kids, we're like, oh, I could do this. And then, boom, you want to put out a kid's book. But it is a moment where you're given a shared language that you and your child, because most of the time you've never had kids before. I never had kids before, but now I get to talk about using this word we found in a book. We both know what it means, and that gives us a shared communication. And even though I'm 45 years older than him, we both know what we're talking about because I've used this one word that's completely made up.
Yep. Yep.
And it's so lovely to bring that across generations, isn't it?
Yeah. And that's part of that second life idea I was saying. You have an imaginative world with your child that can be triggered by a word or anything, usually a word. And that's the thing with books that makes books different from other media, I think, in that it's a very direct conversation between you and the author. And if you're the parent there reading, you're the narrator, it's really direct and very personal. And I think I got an inkling of that with the new series where you and me are me is the narrator. There's no other name.
Yeah.
When the parent is reading to the child, the parent becomes me and the child is you. And one kid said to their father, "Oh, Dad, I wonder where we're going on our adventure tonight."
And what a fantastic, because not everybody's got your creative brain, but you're giving that gift to the parent immediately of, as far as your kid's concerned, you have this amazing imagination. Let's go.
Yeah. Yeah, and it should be fun for you as the parent
Yeah.
too. So again, take out the long passages of unnecessary detail, shorter chapters so we
Yeah.
can get to bed. So I'm writing from all points of
Yeah.
view to make the experience powerful for everybody.
When you're going through the bookshops and looking around, which authors at the moment make you go, damn, that's some good stuff there?
I'm actually, in terms of kids or adults,
Well,
I'm actually reading Lech Blaine at the moment, who's written a book called Australian Gospel about his extraordinary experience of having foster siblings and their estranged father and mother, who the man was a religious zealot. It's extraordinary. And I've been following Lech's writing since his book, memoir, Car Crash, for some years. And he recently got in touch and said, I'm a big fan and I've got this new book. And I was going, oh, my God, that's amazing that you were reading my nonsense and here you are. I really think Australian Gospel is very special. It's like Dickensian, the amount of characters per page and the way he marshals it all into just pure storytelling. So that excites me no end.
Yeah, and that there was a small hand that you had in
tiny,
yeah, but you were part of feeding a subconscious. Like, no, this is what a story is. This is what a story can be. It's a bum running away.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to pass on from the writers I admired, who was Enid Blyton. She knew how to tell a story. Get the kids into trouble by the end of the first chapter, and also people like Lewis Carroll, who wrote Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. I was so fired up by those books. And also this mad bookseller in Melbourne around the turn of last century, Professor Cole, Cole's Funny Picture Books, which were just compendiums of weird pictures, funny verses, horrifying stuff, which was marketed to kids. And it's all out of date now and a bit totally politically incorrect a lot of the time. But they were real the furnace of my imagination. And I went, I need to pass all this on to the next generation, because if I die without having written at least one book, this could be lost. And it's passing on what is an endless tradition of storytelling.
When Mum passed away, you go through your parents' stuff, and I actually grabbed some books that I remember from when we were kids, and she was very into the lineage of I guess publishing and storytelling. She's got stuff from the 1800s, and I've got these kids' books we used to read when we were little. Like terrifying shit like Straw Peter. Have you ever seen that thing?
Oh, I cut my teeth on Straw Peter.
It's frightful. I read it like as a kid, reading these things.
And that's a good example of the message story. They were written ostensibly to teach children what the terrible things that would happen if you don't obey your parents.
Oh, boy.
So the girl who plays with matches, mother says, don't play with matches while I'm out, but she does, and she sets her dress on fire, and then you turn the page and she's burned into a little pile of ashes with nothing but her red ballet slippers and two cats crying their eyes out. Meow, 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 meow. We told her that she'd burn to death if she did so. And even as a kid, I was horrified by it, but I was also amused by it, because I thought, that's too much. Right. If you're trying to teach a kid not to play with matches, that's over the top.
Yeah, right.
So it becomes ridiculous, and the humour, I think, anaesthetizes you against the horror. Yeah. And that's why that book is so etched into many people's minds, I think.
Yeah, there's some pretty early just because you had a printing press and an artist didn't mean you were publishing something that was good for kids.
Oh, but I think it was. I think it was brilliant. Yeah. I think thanks to the internet, many survivors of this book have now got together and sort of gone, did you read that book? Yes, it was awful. Yes. But it is brilliant. It is and it's one of the models I use for my storytelling, along with Grimm's fairy tales. Yeah. They are horrifying, and yet they address fears and concerns that we have in a really vivid, nightmarish way, and they're powerful because they address, Hansel and Gretel. we have the fear of parental abandonment.
Yeah.
It actually happens to them. They find a house made of candy. Who wouldn't want that? And so they gluttony. They eat lots. And then the old lady is a cannibal who's trying to fatten the boy up so she can eat him. And then they push her into the fire, and it's, as far as I'm concerned, murder. And yet we know that story because I think it gives you the ability to name fears as a child, because you're in a powerless position.
Yeah.
And it shows two resilient young children fighting against the odds to get back to their home, and they do.
Wolfie wanted a science party for his 5th birthday. Very lucky to know a guy who goes around to high schools and makes things explode, get kids vibed on physics and science. It's super fun. Could you do Wolfie's party? How old are they? 5. Fuck yeah, I'm there. They love it. Now, Ruben Yeaman is his name. He's shown me grade 11 physics homework done by 7-year-olds. He said they can handle it. We just don't tell them about it till they're 16, but they can absolutely conceive of all of this. What's something that has surprised you in your teaching career or otherwise about the level of creativity in young kids that we may not understand that they are able to do, and therefore we should maybe nurture or push them towards?
We have a number of frequent correspondence kids who write letters and send us pictures and stories. And one young man is obsessed with typewriters, which I was when I was his age.
Magical machines.
Yeah. And you know, year 5, I think he is, year 6, he's typing out stories and just vibing off the thrill of seeing your words in print. And I'm so thrilled to see that and to encourage it and to say, yeah, I used to do that too. Keep going. Some kids can do a really fantastic imitation of my writing, and then I do an imitation of their writing, and it's a virtuous circle. But yeah, I think kids are capable of enormous amounts of creativity and understanding if we trust them and give them the material and don't try to protect them from stuff. And, you know, I had the extraordinary experience. My mother used to run the school fete bookshop. So for a couple of months before, our spare bedroom would fill up with all the neighbourhood's unwanted books. Yeah. Adult books, psychology books, non-fiction, fiction, everything. And I would just be in that room. Like a bookshop literally came to my house. And I remember reading, you know, potboiler adult stuff way before I was able to understand it. But that's fine. You know, I got what I could from it. I read a book called The Magic Power of Your Mind, a 1920 self-help book.
Love it.
That taught you what vast abilities your mind has, you know. And this went in deep. And one book called Worlds to Conquer it was a Reader's Digest collection of chapters from true life adventure novels. Yeah. So I'd learn how to Memoirs of a Sword Swallower went in deep by a guy called Dan Mannix, who was a 1940s carnival guy, and he learned to swallow swords, and he described it in great detail. When the sword goes down and it touches the pit of your stomach, and it makes you want to throw up. But if you do it enough times, you lose the gag reflex. And then that's not enough. He's got to get the newfangled fluorescent tubes to put down their throats. But those newfangled fluorescent tubes were quite thick, so they had to have a sort of join, a big hoop, so they're very thick. And if you left them in your throat too long, they would stick to your skin. Or they could explode. So in my mind, you know, I'm 10 years old just being blown by things I could never have possibly imagined or experienced. Yeah. And so that's why I'm big on books and free reading.
Yeah. When we're at the park with little Wolfie, and when he was younger, he's better at it now, but say if he's climbing on something that's bigger than he's ever done before, rather than say, hey, be careful, buddy, say, it's cool, man. Hands first, then feet, or strong hands, strong feet. Just make sure you got to, and like, just tell him, like, you'll figure it out. Just these two primary things. What's the version of that for getting kids to tell a better story, even when they're telling you about their day?
Well, I guess it's what happened.
Yeah.
You know, what happened at school today. You'll probably get, nothing much. Did anything go wrong? You know, if you're looking for what was out of the ordinary, might help.
Yeah.
My youngest daughter would go into great detail. She could narrate every minute of the school playground shenanigans that were going on, and that was almost too much. Like, I admired the attention to detail. Yeah. And I thought she would grow up to be a great novelist. Yeah. She's very creative, but more in a making sense. So that creativity can take many different forms.
People say they're not, I'm not a creative person. Like, you are.
Absolutely everybody is creative. Yeah. To solve any problem, you consider a range of possibilities. Yeah. And the more you've exercised your imagination, the greater that range of possibilities can be. But yeah, I like the if you put a jar of cookies really high up on a shelf, and that person is hungry, they're going to find a range of creative ways to get to those cookies. And that's what creativity is. It's solving a problem. And so, to answer your question, you can't get genuine creativity without a genuine problem to solve. So that's what I'll give with a kid. Yeah. I'll actually limit it. I'll give them parameters. Yeah. I'll say, I want you to write, could be a 50-word story. You have 50 words to tell me a story with a beginning, middle, and an end. That's a problem, because how do I choose? Well, you've got to make big choices here. Jar labels is one thing. I noticed once that jars of corn relish look a lot like vomit, and I was like, oh, I'd love to buy a jar of corn relish, take it home, soak the label off, and write vomit on it, and then put a set of instructions for its use on the back. And so I did that. I said, it's a great way if you've gone out for a big night and it's been a bit of a dud. Well, before you go to bed, just tip corn relish all over your bed, all over the floor, all over the walls and the roof. And then when you wake up, you'll think, whoa, I had the best night ever. So I wrote all this up. Without being funny, it was like serious. Yeah. And the amount of people who would see it in the fridge and go, is this real? And I go, wow, if you just use a straight face and you work within this jar label parameters, anything is possible. So
I do love the idea of restriction. One of my neighbours is a cinematographer, incredibly talented guy, and he now shoots entirely on digital. So he got his 35mm camera back from the rental because it hasn't gone out in like 3 years. And he's got it sitting on his shelf. And he's got a mag like this, 400 feet, shoots 4 minutes. And I would say to him, like, I remember shooting like that with stills. Like, when you're limited, everyone kind of works a little harder to get it right. You know, if you don't have enough light with you, you got to stop shooting at like an hour before sunset because we can't make anything. So everyone's a little sharper. When you can just keep shooting or keep writing, you don't really know where the edges are.
Yeah, I used to, from working with kids, I'll say audience. Who is the audience? What's the purpose of your communication? And what form are you trying to work in? Is it a jar label? Is it a 50-word story? Is it an essay? Well, then you've got more words. But what purpose? And you might not know your purpose to begin with, but eventually I discovered through trial and error to make the reader laugh is a very big part of what I can do. And I've got a book and I've got an illustrator who's really, I've got a couple now, Bill Hope, who's done adventures, who I need to leave room for on the page. So I've only really got 50 to 100 words per page. So I have to work really hard to make those 50, 100 words count. Yeah. And that's where most of my year goes, is paring them back.
We talked a little about music before. There was a time in your life when Were you the guy in the silver top taking the guy to her door? Were you like driving the cabs?
I was, yes. Yeah.
What did you learn about, you talked about testing before. When you're in that situation, you're cabbie, you're talking. Like storytelling it has, sometimes you've got 10 minutes, sometimes you've got 5 minutes. Did you learn anything from that time in your life that informed what you do now?
I learned to ask the customer, do you have a preferred way to go? And 70% of the time, yes, they would direct you because this is pre-GPS.
Yeah.
But yeah, you learn to be sensitive to who's in the cab, what do they want to talk, do they not want to talk? And often your job was to listen to them talk. And yeah, there was some pretty unpleasant people out there too.
Yeah.
But what I did love was that you would just bounce around the city like a pinball, never quite knowing where you're going to end up next. And the road at 3 a.m. in the morning as you're cruising down, stop at a 7-Eleven for a pie and a coffee. The world was yours and it was another world.
I've had jobs like that where I've had to drive around parts of the city I never grew up in and I never would go. You get so much more of a sense of the community. You actually live in the wider area, and when you're exposed to the different people from different circles than yours, you get a bit of a wider picture.
And you don't have to go a few suburbs from where you live.
No.
To discover whole new worlds that when you notice it when you go travelling. If you go to another country, it's really obvious.
Yeah.
But I like to bring that sensibility into my travels around my neighbourhood. Yeah. You can have that, oh my God, I've never seen the world this way or this place before. Yeah. And I think that's part of what I try to cultivate as a writer, and what reading sensitises you to as well. Makes you see place and feel place. Is special, even if it's ordinary. Yeah.
I mean, besides the fact that I'm not making TV at the moment, I'm in this current phase of like reinventing how I pay the mortgage. It's just really exciting. It could be also terrifying, but I'm choosing for it to be exciting. Yep. And even when I'm like, my biggest fantasy about like if this thing scales and I get that there, but then I'm so not interested in retiring. I mean, I'm 50, but I don't know how I would stay married and not have something to do. Yep. I would be a total punish. How do you see this as a part of this writing? How do you see it as a part of your life from here? I'm sure you're doing great. You know, you could not work if you wanted to, I guess.
Well, we came to the end of the Treehouse series last year, and this was a watershed moment where Terry sort of put up his hand and said, I think, I'm ready.
25 is good. 25 years is
25
good.
years of being bossed around by you, I'll do. No, it was a wonderful collaboration, and the fact we got to 13 Treehouse books. Yeah. We started with 13 levels. Every year we'd add 13. And it was a joke at the first that we'd do 13 books, and then we hit 169. And I went, well, that's the poetic, perfect place to stop. And should I stop now? And there was very strong feedback from our parents and our kids. They were just heartbroken. Is this your last book? The last book you're ever going to write? And I was going, no, it's okay. It's the last Treehouse book, but it's not the last book I'm going to write. And so I felt, because I love writing them too, but there was a very strong sense that please keep writing, because we just love your sensibility. To me, it's like a vast three-dimensional puzzle. Like it's a jigsaw puzzle. You're putting together this narrative which has all these different dimensions, and you can invent pieces of the puzzle if you need to, and you can get rid of pieces. But when you get it all to work, it's just enormously satisfying. It feels like it's really happened to me, and I've just got the perfect narrative, and I can convince other people that it's happened because I've lived it and believed it myself. It gives me, as you say, something to do, to gnaw on all the time.
But you're connecting with people clearly, authentic. Like you're connecting with them in such a way they could be bothered to reach out to you. I mean, if my favorite author didn't write his next book, like I'm not going to email him and go, hey, where is it? They actually give a shit to connect with you and go, hey, buddy.
Yeah. And that's what I've has done since a young child, even in the neighbourhood I grew up in. When I was 10 years old, I was telling these bullshit stories to the 5, 6-year-olds, about things I'd done and fighting sharks in the bath. And they're going, really? And I said, yeah. And the more they go, really, the more I'm dredging up supporting detail. Like I'm making up supporting detail. And that's the story writing process. And it's a game of make-believe that I'm playing with the kids and that we've all entered into it. And it's like, how long can you keep coming up with this stuff before we stop believing? But there is no limit. And so, I'm thrilled to be in a position where people invite me into their house every night to tell them long, silly, made-up stories. Couldn't have worked out better.
I'm thrilled that you made the time to come around, buddy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm so grateful. My nephews will lose their shit when they find out you came around.